We can change the name and shit, right? Hey, there it is. Okay. Okay, what should I name it? Cognitive model of emotions. Study along. Okay, people blog. What category should I put this in? Education. Works. Okay, that works. So, do I need to do something with the lighting? I don't think so. This is fine, right? This looks fine. My hair looks crazy, but whatever. All right. So what we're doing right now is chapter 3, page 60 of Cognitive Therapy and Emotional Disorder by Aaron T. Beck. By the way, his personal working copy signed with his address. What it is. This is Aaron T. Beck with his university address at the back of it. Crazy story. I found this in like a donated books wholesale kind of event. So I've had it since one of the coolest things in my room. Anyways, I'm on page 60 reading the chapter called Meaning and Emotions. So I thought कि साथ साथ live stream ही कर लेते हैं. I'll be sharing my thoughts and I'll be reading it out loud. That plus I'll also try to make like a verbal note of things. So yeah. Okay. Anyways. Za 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 za. There, that's better. That's better. Okay. Anyways. Where was I? The edition involved an unfulfilled expectations and disappointment also incorporates the theme of loss and triggers sadness when a person expects to receive an honor prize or salary raise. He immediately takes partial title to it, as it were. While the object occupies its fantasized place in his domain, he generally experiences some gratification. If he does not receive the expected object, he may experience as much sadness as though he had actually received and then lost it. Intense disappointment is experienced even though the expectation was highly unrealistic. Oh, so pseudo loss of things that you never actually had. But if you only believed that you were entitled to it, or as if you had it, so that also is included in the feeling of loss. Fair enough. I've seen this play with a lot of people, even myself. Many people live the future in the present and experience an anticipated loss as actual. Women, when informed that her husband would be leaving in a few months for a brief business trip, felt as sad as she did when he actually left. When she thought ahead to the time when her children would grow up and leave the house, she was brought to tears. When a possible loss is treated as though it were an actual deprivation, it is labeled a hypothetical loss. Pseudo loss, nahi hypothetical loss. Okay, there's a word for it. A woman would feel sad, for instance, whenever her husband talked to another woman. She would think it's impossible that he may be falling in love with her. Invalid bookkeeping is an example of a pseudo loss. He also calls it pseudo loss. A man experienced a sense of loss whenever he spent money to acquire something of value until he was helped to realize that the expense was more balanced by the acquisition. suspense was more than balanced by the acquisition. Okay. Euphoria and expectation. Just as common sense observation links sadness to loss and necessary condition for euphoria or excitation is the perception or expectation of gain. The loss increases his evaluation of his domain. The, hmm. The person increases his evaluation of his domain. The boundaries of the domain may be expanded, for example, by adding new friends or acquiring new tangible objects or by attaining a goal. A woman may rate her social abilities more highly after her first successful dinner party. A man may like a new suit more after he has been complimented on it. What isn't that how it should work? If you get proof of your abilities, then your confidence in your abilities increase and the effectiveness of your abilities increase because your self-esteem has increased. Interesting. Not only does a positive appraisal leads to self enhancement, produce feelings of euphoria, but anticipation of future pleasure or enhancement may also lead to immediate pleasure. Ooh. In fact, this kind of anticipation thinking can have an escalating effect. For example, a man noted a description of some of his professional work in a newspaper article, and his first thought was that his work actually he was very important to warrant so much. What? In fact, this kind of anticipation thinking can have an escalating effect. This is similar to fucking manifesting and like positive talk and all of that shit. In fact, this kind of anticipatory thinking can have an escalating effect. For example, a man noted a description of some of his professional work in a newspaper article, and his first thought was that his work actually he was very important to warrant so much publicity. The idea produced a notable elevation in his mood. He then thought of all the people who would see this article, and his euphoria increased markedly. Next, he fantasized receiving greater publicity and becoming increasingly famous. With each successive broadening of his expectations, there was a corresponding boost in his mood. Whether or not the person experiences pleasure depends on the meaning attached to a particular situation or object. A young man observed that a girl was watching him. He thought, Nancy likes me. He then generalized this conclusion too, because she likes me, her friends will like me, then I guess I'm pretty popular. People in general like me. As he expanded his positive evaluation, he felt a corresponding elevation of mood. It is not necessary to have a pre existing need or drive fulfilled in order to experience pleasure. Any event or idea that represents a meaningful addition is sufficient to produce pleasure. This is the anticipation of a reward value cheese that Eric Rice? No, not Eric Rice. What's his name? James Clear and Charles Duhigg. Is it Charles Duhigg? Yes, Charles Duhigg talks about anticipation of pleasure. A person, for instance, may unexpectedly receive a gift without ever having wanted it and may nonetheless experience pleasure. However, once he has felt pleasure, then the person may develop an active desire for more of the pleasure producing object. A taste of fame may make a person hungry for more in order to maintain his new self evaluation. Taste of fame may make a person hungry for more in order to maintain self evaluation. Thus, an increase in self evaluation may have a substantial effect on motivation. Receiving a reward can result in a generalized increase in the expectation of rewards and consequently energize the person to work more productively. That is happening right now. This principle is particularly useful in developing depressed patients. Oh, principle is particularly useful in helping depressed patients overcome their inertia. Feedback mechanisms may play a role in escalating the response to gains. Subjective experience of euphoria after a self enhancing event may be interpreted as further evidence that the event is a good thing. This positive appraisal may stimulate further desires for the pleasure inducing object or circumstances. Oh, so the feedback cycle needs to be okay, fair. Anxiety. It is a commonplace observation that when someone considers himself in imminent danger, ये लिख लेता हूँ ना. Alrighty. Just write it पहले भी नहीं था, मैं लिख लेता हूँ. Q, Q. Okay. It's a commonplace observation that when someone considers himself in imminent danger, he is likely to feel anxious. Threats of physical harm, serious illness, economic disaster, or social rejection quickly come to mind as typical anxiety producing situations. Moreover, we can observe that a threat, real or imaginary, to the safety, health, or psychological state of any other person within his personal domain may also produce anxiety. A person may also become anxious if he perceives a danger to some institution or principle he values. The prospect of losing some important object and animate or inanimate in another common kind of threat to the personal domain. Moreover, he can observe a threat, real or imaginary, to the safety, health, or psychological state of any other person within his personal domain may also produce anxiety. Okay. A person may also become anxious if he perceives a danger to some institution or principle he values. The prospect of losing some important object, animate or inanimate, is another common kind of threat to the personal domain. A person may become anxious when threatened with losing money or material possessions. Anxiety may also be induced by the anticipated loss of a friend or relative through geographical separation. A person may become anxious when threatened with losing money or material possessions. Anxiety may also be induced by the anticipated loss of a friend, a relative through geographical separation, sickness, or death of the other person. Anxiety in response to psychosocial threats such as anticipation of criticism, humiliation, or desertion has the same quality as distress over threats of physical harm or illness. We label anticipation of damage, fear, and the unpleasant emotional reaction anxiety. We label anticipation of damage, fear, and the unpleasant emotional reaction anxiety. If a person feels confident in his ability to cope with or repel the threat, anxiety is minimized. It is increased when he considers the potential damage to his domain as imminent, highly probable, and highly destructive. Anxiety may be further increased by uncertainty with regard to when the harm may occur. That is pretty basic. That if you're confident in your ability to deal with the threat, the anticipation or the feelings around that threat or the anxiety around that threat is mitigated. Fair enough. And if the timing is uncertain, तो anxiety और ज़्यादा बढ़ जाएगी. Fair enough. And identifying a situation as dangerous, one must make a series of almost simultaneous judgments. The initial judgment, which Richard Lazarus terms primary appraisal, identifies the situation as a threat and assesses the probability, imminence, and degree of the potential harm. Next comes secondary appraisal, an estimate of one's counter harm resources, that is, ability to neutralize or cope with the danger. The ratio between the negative factors in the primary appraisal and the positive factor and the secondary appraisal constitute the perceived risk. Negative factors in the primary appraisal. Primary appraisal mean negative factor. Identifies the situation as a threat and assesses the probability, imminence and degree of the potential harm. तो उसमें जितने ज़्यादा नेगेटिव फैक्टर्स होंगे एंड काउंटर हार्म रिसोर्सेज जितने ज़्यादा पॉजिटिव होंगे उनका रेशियो constitutes the perceived risk. Okay, the latter in turn determines the intensity of anxiety. Okay, the importance of meaning is the arousal. The importance of meaning in the arousal is illustrated by the large variety of situations that produce this emotional response and in the degree to which it occurs in different individuals in the same situation. We are familiar with the fact that someone who is highly sensitive to social disapproval may become alarmed if placed in a situation in which his weakness could be exposed. The importance of meaning in the arousal is illustrated by the large variety of situations that produces the emotional response and in the degree to which it occurs in different individuals in the same situation. We are familiar with the fact that someone who is highly sensitive to social disapproval may become alarmed if placed in a situation in which his weakness could be exposed. For example, he may consider having to speak before an audience as a potential catastrophe. Another person will experience minimal or no anxiety in such a situation because he attaches a different meaning to other people's possible evaluation of him. Similarly, unusual anxiety reactions to situations or objects that are generally considered safe are found to be related to private idiosyncratic meanings. Similarly, unusual anxiety reactions to situations or objects that are generally considered safe are found to be related to private idiosyncratic meanings. A healthy woman, for instance, experienced anxiety whenever she became short of breath following exertion because she thought she was having a heart attack. A man felt anxious whenever he was on a bridge because as he crossed over, he would have a visual image of the bridge collapsing. Later, we shall consider other illustrations of the crucial role of meaning in pathological states of anxiety. Yeah, okay, interesting. One of the examples usually cited as the prototype of anger is the reaction of a primary organism to destroy or repel a noxious agent. One of the examples occasionally cited as the prototype of anger is the reaction of a primitive organism to destroy or repel a noxious agent. This analogy illuminates one basic pattern in humans. When a person is attacked physically or verbally, he may become angry and counterattack. Although the formula attack leads to anger fits some of the most obvious conditions for generations of anger, it does not always apply. We know of instances in which an attacked person has felt paralyzed with anxiety or has become sad after being defeated in a physical battle. Other mammals, such as chimpanzees and dogs, respond to attack with reactions that seem to resemble human anxiety or depression. We know of instances in which an attacked person has felt paralyzed with anxiety or has become sad after being defeated in a physical battle. Other mammals, such as chimpanzees and dogs, respond to attack with reactions that seem to resemble human anxiety or depression. Cannon describes reactions to attack in terms of a fight or flight pattern corresponding roughly to anger or anxiety. Fuck. Although the formula, attack leads to anger, fits some of the most obvious conditions for generations of anger, it does not always apply. We know of instances in which an attacked person has felt paralyzed with anxiety or has become sad after being defeated in a physical battle. Other mammals, such as chimpanzees and dogs, respond to attack with reactions that seem to resemble human anxiety or depression. Other mammals, such as chimpanzees and dogs, respond to attack with reactions that seem to resemble human anxiety or depression. Desperation. Depression. Cannon describes reactions to attack in terms of a fight or flight response, fight or flight pattern corresponding roughly to anger or anxiety. His formula, however, does not account for a depressive response, nor does it specify the reason for individual differences. Another familiar situation that often produces anger is the frustration of a wish or drive. This common observation was expanded by Dollard et al. 1939 into a broad theory, the frustration anger hypothesis, proposing to account for the spectrum of aggressive and hostile behavior. When subjected to critical analysis, however, it becomes apparent that their concept encompasses only a limited range of anger producing situations. Furthermore, by overlooking the meaning of frustration under varying circumstances, the authors include instances of frustration that do not produce anger, as pointed out by Alice and demonstrated experimentally by Pasteur 1950-52. People are likely to respond with anger if they judge the frustrating agent to be justified, non-arbitrary, or reasonable. Uh, okay. A husband who generally becomes angry if his dinner is not ready when he comes home will be annoyed if he discovers his wife was too sick to prepare the meal. Ah. If we reflect on the kinds of situation that can produce anger ranging from mild irritation to extreme fury, we can probably think of an almost endless variety. We would be hard put to consider the different kinds of anger producing situations as all related to some kind. Nonetheless, by signaling out the central features of these situations, it is possible to expose the bounds of kinship. Transgression, intentional or unintentional, and intentional and unintentional. Consider these examples from the broad spectrum of everyday situations that often produce anger. An adult is pelted with stones by a gang of adolescents. Transgression, intentional and unintentional. Consider these examples from the broad spectrum of everyday situations that often produce anger. An adult is pelted with stones by a gang of adolescents. A student is singled out for reprimand by his teacher for whispering with several other students during class. A theater goer attempts to purchase a ticket and thwarted by someone pushing ahead of him in line at the box office. A woman is jilted by her lover. What is jilted? JLTD. Suddenly end a romantic relationship with somebody in an unkind way. Oh, it's like a bad breakup. Oh wow, good word. Yeah, right. A child is told by his parents that he must share his toys with a sibling. A member of a committee attempting to introduce a new policy is opposed by other committeemen. At least one common thread runs through each of these confrontations. The main character or protagonist is subjected to an unpleasant experience, the offense, by one or more adversaries. He is the object of deliberate physical attack, criticism, coercion, thwarting, rejection, deprivation, or opposition. These situations are noxious because they encroach on the protagonist's safety, self esteem, or desires. They are perceived as a deliberate, direct impingement on his domain, even when offense is not motivated by malice. It may be perceived as such by the protagonist. Fair enough. Another group of anger producing situations is composed of commands and restrictions, which the individual interprets as encroaching on his rights. A restriction by a person in authority may make an individual angry, though he had no prior desire to engage in the forbidden activity. His rights may include not only autonomy, freedom of action, and freedom of expression, but also expectations of respect, courtesy, consideration, and loyalty from other people. Social professional status may prompt the expectations of special privileges and may cause offense if they are not accorded, or anger if a person of lower status tries to claim privilege to which he is not entitled. Very interesting. Oh, I am meaning to try a Coca Cola tonight. Coffee with Diet Coke. Sounds good. Let's see how it goes. Good water. All right. Indirect transgression. Still another type of interaction. Still another type of interaction accounts for many of the angry responses we experience ourselves or may observe in others. The following situation do not appear at first glance to represent a direct assault on the domain, yet they may produce anger. A host feels annoyed at a guest for showing off his knowledge at a dinner party. A clerical worker is irritated at a friend's story of his success in business. A young man is furious with his girlfriend for chanting in an animated way with another man. A student who received an outstanding grade becomes annoyed at his professor when he learns the professor gave the same grade to a fellow student. A husband is infuriated because his wife gives him only a mild compliment for what he considers a major business triumph. Bruh, what has happened to fucking Google meanings? Okay, fair enough. On analyzing these situations, we can understand that they are regarded as noxious. The meaning of each is an assault on the self esteem of the protagonist. The behavior of the offender indirectly exposes the protagonist to self devaluation. The first group of incidents are examples of jealousy or envy. The attention getters are offensive because they threaten to dim the image of the protagonist. He is getting all the rejection, and I'm not getting any. He is making a better impression than I. He is more successful than I. Such comparison lead the protagonist to question his own importance. The student's enhanced self esteem for receiving an outstanding grade is diminished when he loses the exclusiveness of his claim to excellence. The husband is annoyed at the wife's lukewarm response when it seems to devalue his achievement. Because it seems to devalue his achievement. Okay. Since the offenses represent a kind of loss, why does the protagonist feel anger rather than sad? We find that he experiences anger as long as he is able to ward off his devaluation by focusing on negative attributes of the offender. He is a show off and deserving, empty headed, unfair. If, however, the protagonist accepts the imagined loss of status as reasonable, just or fair, he then feels sad. Oh, so as long as they can attribute the offender's meaning to a negative, as long as they can find a negative attribute in the offender, they'll be angry because they have justified why he would say they have justified malice behind his actions. And if they cannot, if they find it reasonable or justified, they would feel sad because he's such evil types. All right, interesting. If he fluctuates between blaming the offender and regretting his loss, the mood oscillates between anger and sadness. Okay. Hypothetical transgression. We can think of other instances in which neither a direct nor an indirect transgression seem to account for an angry reaction. A pedestrian becomes angry at seeing a motorist drive. A pedestrian becomes angry at seeing a motorist drive through a stop signal. A parent is incensed at his child for not showing good table manners. A wealthy man is infuriated at being approached for a charitable contribution. A man devoted to the principle of law, another becomes enraged at hearing of a crime committed thousands of miles away. None of these episodes produce an obvious infringement of the individual's domain, yet He may react as strongly as he would to a direct assault. He may readily acknowledge that he was in no way personally damaged by the event. If this is correct, then why is he angered? The common denominator in each of these incidents is that the offender has violated a rule regarded as important to the offended. Because this violation leads the protagonist to regard himself as vulnerable, it represents a potential or hypothetical transgression. A pedestrian explains his anger at the speeding motorist. I could have been walking across the street at that time, or might have crossed at some future time when the motorist was speeding through. The parent is annoyed with her child because she conjectures that if an outsider were present, he might judge her to be a bad mother for rearing an ill mannered child. The wealthy man is incensed because he speculates, if I had to give money to every charity, I would go broke. The man is infuriated by being approached by a charitable contribution. Oh, yeah. Okay. Even hypothetical attacks, the notion that it could happen carries almost as much weight as if it did happen. The hypothetical infringements, although subtle, account for a large proportion of the discord in human relations. As we proceed, we shall see that these offenses consist largely of the violation of some generally accepted rules of proper behavior, or in some instances, certain idiosyncratic rules and standards. The imposition of a value judgment on other people's behavior points to the existence of an implicit code or laws, rules, principles, and standards. These rules seem to be applied as though they serve to protect the protagonist from physical or psychological harm, even though his person and his domain are in no way involved. In an interaction with the offender, thus the pedestrian, although not actually endangered, becomes furious at the motorist because violation of the law might affect the future safety. The principles of fair play, justice, and reasonableness constitute a kind of outer wall or defense of the domain. Arbitrary, unfair, unjust acts arouse anger, even when not directed against a particular person, because they are regarded as a threat to the protective wall. Other customs affecting human interactions are heavily invested with importance. Diagnostic clues of the violation of such conventions are found in anger complaints, such as they have no right to act that way. He should have, he should not have done that. Those people should behave better. Is the principle of the thing. A middle aged business executive becomes infuriated by a host of behavior patterns in other persons, such as their being loudmouth, aggressive, careless, or unkempt. Kempt. What is unkempt? Kempt. Unkempt. Someone or something that is untidy. Isn't it unkept? मैं हमेशा unkept सोचता था. Oh, unkempt. Wow. Okay. On being questioned, he readily admits that he has not personally experienced any injury or loss from this behavior. He protests nonetheless that such a behavior is wrong or bad. The offender should be punished in some way. Those hippies have no business wearing their hair so long and being so dirty, they should be locked up. Acceptable forms of behavior constitute a moral code that is embedded in the domain. A bench of the code produces the same reaction as an attack. A breach of the code produces the same reaction as an attack. Okay. The personal code varies widely within a cultural group and may be idiosyncratic. Anger produced by violation of such codes may seem inappropriate and unhealthy to others, but it seems appropriate to the individual who has his own standards of right and wrong. A violation of his personal standards is regarded as an attack on his domain. Social conventions appear to play a greater role than is generally recognized in specifying the condition under which anger is considered justified, expected, or even demanded, but also set the limits beyond which anger is deemed excessive or inappropriate. Social conventions appear to play a greater role than is generally recognized in specifying the condition under which anger is considered justified, expected, or fuck. I was thinking something else. Acceptable forms of behavior constitute a moral code that is embedded in the domain. A breach of the code produces the same reaction as an attack. The personal code varies widely within a cultural group and may be idiosyncratic. Anger produced by violation of such codes may seem inappropriate and unhealthy to others, but it seems appropriate to the individual who has his own standards of right and wrong. A violation of this personal standards is regarded as an attack on his domain. Social convention appear to play a greater role than is generally recognized in specifying the conditions under which anger is considered justified, expected, or even demanded. Social convention appear to play a greater role than is generally recognized in specifying the condition under which anger is considered justified, expected, or even demanded, but also set the limits beyond which anger is deemed excessive or inappropriate. Such limits are implied in statements such as "you're overreacting" or "why the temper tantrum." We have probably all encountered situations that made us angry but did not affect a friend or vice versa. Similarly, when we have reacted with equanimity to a noxious situation, we may have been told you should have gotten angry, or I would have told him off. When a person exhibits a strong outburst of anger over what is generally regarded as a trivial incident, we may suspect that the situation has a special idiosyncratic meaning for him. We can now summarize the kinds of situation that commonly lead to anger: direct and intentional attack, direct unintentional attack, violation of law, standards, social norms, social mores. The fuck mores? Hypothetical threat, substandard behavior, breach of idiosyncratic moral code. The common factor for arousal of anger is the individual's appraisal of an assault on his domain, including his values, moral code, and protective rules. This factor, while a necessary condition, is not sufficient in itself to arouse anger. In order to provoke anger, other specific conditions must be present. First, the individual must take the infringement seriously and label it negatively. A small child throwing snowballs at his parent is likely to provoke amusement rather than anger. Second, the individual must not consider the noxious situation an immediate or continuing danger. The individual must not consider the noxious situation an immediate or continuing danger. If he is considered primarily. Bro, what? First, the individual must take the infringement seriously and label it negatively. A small child throwing snowballs at his parents is likely to provoke amusement rather than anger. Second, the individual must not consider the noxious situation, must not consider the noxious situation an immediate or continuing threat. If he is concerned primarily with his own safety, he will be more anxious than angry. Oh. Third, the individual must focus primarily on the wrongfulness of the offense and the offender rather than any injury he may have sustained. I see. The sequence of psychological reactions leading to anger may be compared with the steps in the production of anxiety. The individual makes a primary appraisal in recognizing and labeling the noxious stimulus. Concomitantly, concomitantly, the fuck is that word? Concomitantly, CONCOMI, concomitant. The fuck is that word?
Concomitant. Concomitant.
Refers to something that naturally accompanies, is connected with, or occurs at the same time as something else. Subsequent. Accompanying, co-occurring. Subsequent is following, entailing. Concomiting. Concomitant. Co-accompanying. God damn. The individual makes a primary appraisal in recognizing and labeling the noxious stimulus. Concomitantly, he assesses his ability to sustain, neutralize, or repel the impact of the noxious stimulus. Secondary appraisal. In the following example, the protagonist fluctuated between anger and anxiety as his confidence in his ability to repel the noxious stimulus increased and faded. A college student was blocked in traffic by a slowly moving car. He became very angry because he was both inconvenienced and offended by the driver's disregard for an accepted rule of driving. He sounded his horn repeatedly and swore at the driver. He regarded himself as strong enough to cope with possible retaliation, which in any event he considered unlikely. To his surprise, the driver got out of his car. The student was angered even further by at such pugnacity. Pugnacity, the fuck. When it became plain that the second driver was huge and menacing, the student became anxious and drove off quickly. When he was a safe distance away, the student felt another wave of anger as he reflected the big bully trying to push me around. This example illustrates that when a person is not concerned about his safety, he is prone to experience anger toward the offending agent. When he focuses primarily on imminent danger, his anger is replaced by anxiety. Analogous fluctuations between anger and sadness was experienced by a man whose wife had reprimanded him severely. One moment he would think about how unjust she was to criticize him, and he would feel angry at her. Then he would shift to the idea that he had lost her affection and would feel sad. All day, the focus of his thinking alternated between blaming his wife and being deprived of love, with corresponding oscillations between anger and sadness. Okay. The degree of anger is generally proportional to how reasonable or arbitrary or improper the offense seems to the protagonist. These characteristics are of extreme importance in understanding excessive reactions to what may seem to be trivial offenses. The conditions that accentuate anger after an offense has occurred may be summarized as follows: offense perceived as intentional, offense perceived as malicious, offense perceived as unjustified, unfair, unreasonable, offender perceived as undesirable person, possibility of blaming or disqualifying offender. Mm. Converse conditions tend to reduce the anger. Converse conditions tend to reduce the anger. Example: the offense is perceived as accidental, well intentioned or justified. Other mitigating factors are the protagonist's view of the offender as a nice guy or his belief that he himself was at fault. Converse conditions tend to reduce the anger. Example: the offense is perceived as accidental, well intentioned, or justified. Other mitigating factors are the protagonist's view of the offender as a nice guy or his belief that he himself was at fault. Distinguishing among arousal of sadness, anger, and anxiety. Sadness, anger, and anxiety. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna go pee before the next subsection. I also check for messages. should get water as well. अब अगर उठाएं Alrighty. I got it. Distinguishing among arousal of sadness, anger, and anxiety. Everyday observation indicate that some external condition may produce sadness in one person, anxiety in another, and anger in a third. Moreover, circumstances that seem basically alike may make someone sad at one time, anxious at another, and angry at third. We know the meaning attached to the event. We can generally predict which emotion will be aroused. Paramount meanings are determined by the person's habitual pattern of conceptualizing particular kinds of life situations and also by his psychological state at the time the situation occurs. If his main concern is with danger, he feels anxious. If he is preoccupied with loss, he feels sad. If he focuses on the unacceptable behavior of the offender, he feels anger. The necessary and sufficient condition for the arousal of each emotion may be demonstrated by pinpointing how similar conditions may produce different emotions. Sadness versus anger. Downgrading, as by insult or criticism, may produce either sadness or anger. If one accepts the validity of the insult sufficiently to lower his evaluation of himself, then he feels sad. Similarly, even when he considers an insult invalid, he may feel sad provided he considers merely being insulted a bad reflection on him. If the criticism or insult is perceived as unwarranted, unacceptable, or unjust, he is likely to experience anger. The person may criticize that if he accepts the validity of the criticism, he may feel sad or guilty. However, if he can discredit the criticism by disqualifying his critic, he is likely to experience anger instead of sadness. Hmm. Very interesting. Sadness versus anxiety. A person is likely to feel sad rather than anxious when the loss has already occurred or when the domain has been devalued in expectation of a loss. He will experience anxiety as long as he regards himself as still intact and the loss or other injury as only imminent. An example of the production of sadness rather than anxiety in anticipation of a noxious event is the knowledge of some future loss, be it an important person, job, or status. Sadness results if the projected loss is experienced in the present rather than in the future. That is when the person makes this abstraction from his domain before the actual loss occurs. Anxiety versus anger. For the arousal of anxiety, the salient feature is danger. The person is concerned primarily with the possibility of being hurt and with his perceived lack of coping devices to deal with the noxious stimulus. In the case of anger, he is more concerned with the violation of rights, values, and principles, and with the blameworthiness of the offensive agent, and less so with the danger to himself. The typical ideation leading to anxiety, either anxiety, sadness, euphoria, or anger, has a counterpart in the characteristic ideation found in anxiety reactions. Depression, mania, and paranoid states, respectively, a significant difference between psychological disorders and normal emotional responses is that the ideational content of the disorder contains a consistent distortion of a realistic situation, whereas the normal emotional response is based on a reasonable appraisal of the reality situation. The response's psychological disturbances are determined to a far greater degree by internal, that is, psychological factor that confound the appraisal of reality. And we have reached chapter 4, cognitive content of the emotional disorder. The neurotic is not only emotionally sick, he is cognitively wrong. That is Abraham Maslow. Hmm. The neurotic is not only emotionally sick, he is cognitively wrong. Abraham Maslow. Nice. Okay. Cognitive content of the emotional disorder. I do want to share something. So, this guy, Aaron D. Beck, considered the father of the cognitive behavioral therapy, has a daughter who wrote this book specifically on cognitive behavioral therapy, basics and beyond, and its foreword is by Aaron D. Beck. Cognitive therapy for challenging problems, what to do when the basics don't work. Okay. To my father, Aaron T. Beck, and the wonderful staff of the Beck Institute for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Okay. I do want to read this precedent. What? Oh. Because it has a lot of models. This shit. I really want to read this shit. Has plenty of models and like work thoughts and like worksheets, guidelines, cases. This is gonna be like a workbook for me. I cannot wait to complete this principal work and then get to the more practical thingy. This is giving me plenty of ideas and frameworks, but like that's its function or its purpose is to deliver those. I have to derive. This is more fun as well. Anyways, the capacity of human beings to integrate married environmental events and to react adaptively to a tribute to our psychological is a tribute to our psychological development. Even more striking is our ability to discriminate among the subtle cues in interpersonal situations and our resilience in the face of disappointment and frustration. The ability to use imagination creatively and yet to check it with impinging on our sense of reality is further evidence of our maturation. I need a break. Let's take a break. What can I do in the break? Let me find a bookmark first. Let's take a break for 17 minutes until 2 o'clock. Yeah. The break. This is broke the chair last time. I want to do the same thing. Oh, we could play chess. Let's play like a couple of matches of chess. Let's see if I've still got it. There. Shoo, 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 shoo. Shoo, 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 shoo. Shoo, 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 shoo. Alrighty, we're white. Zum, 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 zum. I like the clicky sound of the pieces moving. I play kind of fast. It's just how I play. Nazin Speso. Cha, 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 cha. Cha, cha, cha. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ta, ta. Z, 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 z. Z, z, z. Z, z, z. Z, 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 z. Okay, so if I do this, he does this, I do this, he does this, we need this side. Takes. We don't want that. It's a fair trade, but fine. Need to move this and go here. The fuck? Okay. If it goes here, takes, plenty defense here. Can't do nothing here. Okay. Hmm. Takes. We need another defense here. But, uh-oh. Yeah, we can just do this. Go ahead, I'll take this. Let's go here. Bro, what? Oh, because if I take this, he's got this. Uh, you cannot move this shit here. Hmm. Okay. Now he's gonna do that. Fuck, this game is lost. Not a very good showing, is it? Fuck these. I fucking hate these corner moves. Anyways. Okay. Bro, what you trying to do? If I go there, he's gonna go there. What you gonna do? What you gonna do in the kung fu? Pop boys, pop boys. What you gonna do? What you gonna do in the kung fu? You pop boys, pop boys. Okay. Can't do that, can't do that. Stick this. Takes back there. Yep. Enough, enough, enough. I'll do this. Sure, no worries. What? So I'm gonna take this off first. I don't have any fucking. Cannot do this, cannot do this. Bro, what? He's trying to do this, yeah. Unlucky. Okay. Bruh, what? Shite. Sure about this was. Fuck. Check. Takes. Check. Think we could do something. think there's a player. Let's see. What? Start what he's trying to do. Show it. Check. Shite. If he escapes there, that's a problem. If he escapes there, we can at least have this. If we do this, we might have a draw. Might. Brother. Yeah, I ain't exchanging shit. But what do I do? We should do this. And then this. Weird. Shall we? There are 4 minutes left. Yep, thought so. Okay, if I do this, then this is blocked. And we need to check from here. This is blocked. This is still not blocked. Fuck. These are still open. Bruh. Here. That's a problem. Fuck, is that a mate? Oh, shit, it is. It is a mate. Let's see if we can find it. John Triana. Trina. Tarina. Bruh, what? Shit. He found the checkmate after that. I could have done anything better. Not really. Anyways, after takes this could have been the play. He's there. I could. Then the check is I could do this. There was no play. Shite, mate. Shite. Anyways. Okay, the stream has been going for about 1 hour 20 minutes. Alright. I'll be back from the loo in like a bit. Can I pause it? I think so. I can pause it. Okay, anyways. I'll be back. Bro, there are so many fucking mosquitoes out there. Anyways, I'm gonna turn the fan a little up. Okay. Let's get back to it. Let's get back to it. Should we read the fourth chapter of this? कितने pages में 100 तक पहुंच रहे हैं. If we're reaching page 100, फिर तो बनता है. We're reaching 102. Paradoxes of Depression, T.S. Eliot. What are the names of the chapters? Is there an index? I think there is an index. Yep. Cognitive content of the emotional disorders, the paradoxes of depression, the alarm is worse than the fire, anxiety, neurosis, afraid but not afraid, phobias and obsessions, mind over body, psychosomatic disorder, and hysteria, principles of cognitive therapy, techniques of cognitive therapy, the cognitive therapy of depression, the status of cognitive therapy. I do need to complete it as soon as possible. Good. Good. Should we go make the thingy? Let's just stick to cognitive therapy and emotional disorders. Yeah. Not gonna. Oh, वैसे मेरा just like trying to see where was I? I had reached like chapter 3 ka some part, brain and the human behavior. That's chapter 2. I think the chapter 3 पे पहुंच गया था यार. I'm pretty sure. Drugs. Five? Fuck nah. Wasn't on chapter 5. Chapter 2 is biology, culture, and human behavior. I'm pretty sure I had completed this because I was over the biology. Sensation and perception. Oh, yeah, I was reading this. Yes. I remember this. Sensory threshold. Yep. Wavelengths. Eyes का मैंने पढ़ लिया था. Oh, we do have a mark. Bookmark. If you can see it. Yes, there. We were at hearing. Okay, hearing से आगे there is touch and other skin senses, kinesthesia, perception, time perception. That's it. Okay, there's like 15 something pages. Oh no, it's not it. Biological rhythms, walking states of consciousness. This is the same chapter, right? No, that's a different chapter. States of consciousness I was with. All right. So there's like 15 pages. I'll try to do this as well soon. Really fucking soon. जो मच्छर हैं जो पहले वाले लड़े हैं वो मेरे को तंग कर रहे हैं. Helmet. I hate mosquitoes. What's the point of mosquitoes? What is the point of mosquitoes? So they serve three primary ecological purposes. They are vital food sources for a wide variety of wildlife. They act as important pollinators. So do they pollinate? And their larvae recycle organic matter in aquatic ecosystems. Bruh. Fuck off. We don't need mosquitoes. Bees can do overtime. Will nature survive without humans? Can nature survive without humans? If it can, why did we even evolve? Why did we? The fuck? Why did humans gain consciousness? Survival, but why did nature give us consciousness? Fucking helmet. Anyways, back to it. Back to it. There it is. So one fucker. The neurotic is only emotionally sick. Is not only emotionally sick. He's cognitively wrong. The capacity of human beings to integrate merit environmental events and to react adaptively to attribute to is a tribute to our psychological development. Even more striking is our ability to discriminate among the subtle cues in interpersonal situations and our resilience in the face of disappointment and frustration. The ability to use imagination creatively and yet to check it from impinging on our sense of reality is further evidence of our maturation. Despite this glowing picture, it is obvious that we do not respond consistently well to all challenges. We have specific vulnerabilities, fault lines along which stresses accumulate and may set off tremors or eruptions. Behavior commonly labeled overreacting. Under such conditions, unrealistic appraisals override realistic appraisals. Under such conditions, unrealistic appraisals override realistic appraisals. And we may realize that our reactions are largely irrational. We are all familiar with examples of overreacting. A man suddenly becomes belligerent with his friends when his friends question his role as an authority in a particular area. A generally self composed woman becomes very upset when she finds she doesn't have a thing to wear to a formal dinner. A student who receives a lower grade than expected on an examination becomes morose and considers himself a total failure. Such instances of excessive or inappropriate emotional reaction point to the importance of the internal dramas that permeate our experiences. We envision clashes of the forces of good and evil, triumphs and tragedies, heroics and infamies. We have glimpses of these internal theatricals in our dreams and daydreams. When the dramatic force of these productions sweep over our rational appraisal, we experience excessive or inappropriate emotional reactions. Some people become so engulfed by these internally generated fantasies that their behavior and emotions are controlled by the fantasies. When the inappropriate or excessive reactions burden beyond a certain point or level of distress or disability, then we are likely to label them emotional disorder, neurosis, psychological disturbances, or psychiatric disease. These disorders frequently amuse a characteristic, assume a characteristic form that allows them to be fitted into a generally recognized category such as depression, anxiety state, or paranoid state. Although related to the kinds of emotional reactions already described in chapter 3, these psychological disorders differ from normal emotional disorders because of the intrusion of unrealistic thinking regarding key issues in the patient's life. The disturbance The disturbance in thinking can be best illustrated by one of the most dramatic syndromes seen by therapists: acute neurosis. The acute emotional disturbance. The misery of psychiatric disorders is epitomed by the acute neurotic reaction. In its most flagrant form, this reaction is manifested by a variety of intense, unpleasant experiences. Familiar objects seem strange, distorted, or unreal. Moreover, the patient's internal experiences seem peculiar. He may experience loss of normal sensation in his limbs or in the interior of his body. His body may feel heavy or weightless. He may experience loss of normal sensation in his limbs or in the interior of his body. His body may feel heavy or weightless. Events take on new meanings and significances. A past occurrence previously recorded as trivial looms large. Such reactions are generally beyond the realm of the patient's ordinary experience. Some patients compare the strangeness of the experience through reactions while undergoing anesthesia, having a bad trip under the influence of drugs, or having a nightmare. A devastating aspect of the acute emotional disturbance is the slippage of controls previously taken for granted. The patient has to grapple to remain voluntary control over concentration, attention, and focusing. He has trouble framing his thoughts or following along a consistent line of thinking. His awareness of himself and of his surrounding is not only altered but diminished, so that he has difficulty in perceiving many details in his environment. Paradoxically, however, he may be exquisitely sensitive to such stimuli as the tone of a person's voice or certain internal sensations. He may be confused to the point of disorientation, even though he may correctly identify who he is and where he is. He is not positive of this identification. The extreme form of this disturbance has been labeled a catastrophic reaction. The person expresses his uncanny experiences by descriptions such as, I don't feel that I'm really here, I feel different, things look different, I'm trying to capture the quality of the experience. He applies such terms as, I feel I am losing my grip, I am going out of my mind, I am dying, I feel I am ready to pass out, I am coming apart, I am going crazy. Although these airy feelings are often interrupted by the afflicted as a sign that he is going insane, they are generally associated with acute neurotic reaction rather than with psychosis. In addition to experiencing the strange feelings and disruption of ordinary psychological processes described above, the patient may be engulfed by intense anxiety, sadness, or rage, even when the emotion is a magnification of a pleasant feeling, such as the euphoria of manic reactions. Its intensity makes it unpleasant. It is possible to make sense out of strange. Is it possible to make sense out of the strange psychological phenomena in an acute neurosis? A striking component of the peculiar experiences is intense self consciousness. The patient becomes overly aware of his internal processes. His attention is fixed on his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, with the result that these psychological processes become extremely vivid. In addition, he is overly attentive to certain cues in his environment and oblivious to other tunnel vision. With the binding of this attention to specific internal and external stimuli, the patient has great difficulty in mobilizing significant attention to focus on other areas of experience. Okay. The phenomena of self consciousness and attention binding in acute neurosis is similar to reactions experienced by many people in realistically threatening situations. A student taking an important oral written examination may experience anxiety because of the threat to his life objectives. He finds it difficult to focus on his immediate task, reading or listening to the questions, and drawing on his memory to supply the answers. His attention is drawn instead to ideas that about failing continual evaluation of his performance and scanning of his unpleasant emotional state. Because the fixation of his attention on these distracting ideas, he has difficulty in making sense out of the questions, and he experiences blocking in his attempts to recall material and to form the appropriate sentences. His blocking and impaired efficiency are produced not by the anxiety per se, but by the binding of his attention to irrelevant thoughts and feelings. A similar set of psychological reaction may cause a similar set of psychological reactions may ensue upon exposure to physical danger. Again, his attention is drawn instead to ideas about failing, continual evaluation of his performance, and scanning of his unpleasant emotional state. Because of the fixation of his attention on these distracting ideas, he has difficulty in making sense out of the questions, and he has experiences blocking in his attempt and he experiences blocking in his attempt to recall material and to form the appropriate sentences. His blocking and impaired efficiency are produced not by the anxiety per se, but by the binding of his attention to irrelevant thoughts and feelings. A similar set of psychological reactions may ensue upon exposure to physical danger. A soldier exposed to combat for the first time may experience difficulties in concentration and shifting his focus. His attention may be so fixed on the notion of danger and the wish to escape that he is unable to understand and follow commands that will protect his life. Similar experiences are reported by people in other precarious situations. A novice hiking along a steep mountain slope may be so preoccupied with the notion of falling that he walks clumsily, stumbles, thus placing himself in jeopardy. Compare the reactions to realistic threats with those experienced by a patient with an acute anxiety neurosis. The patient similarly is overly alert to stimuli relevant to danger. Any change in his environment, such as an unexpected sound, his attention. He is overly vigilant to any sign that might be indicative of danger. At the same time, he has difficulty in focusing his attention on those components of environment that do not denote danger. Despite the similarities, the patient with acute anxiety reaction differs significantly from the person exposed to a realistic threat. The danger the patient perceives is non existent or blown out of proportion. He is not only preoccupied with the idea of danger, but he consistently misinterprets innoxious stimuli as indicative of danger. The problem with the anxiety neurotic is not primarily in labeling stimuli. He can readily label a loud sound, but in the meaning and significances he attaches to certain stimuli. His interpretations tend to be far fetched, improbable, unrealistic. The sound of a siren indicates his house is on fire, a pain in the back of his head suggests he is having a stroke, an approaching stranger is regarded as an assailant. The cumulative effect of indiscriminately interpreting events as danger signals as a warped view of the real world and escalating anxiety. The misconstruing of situations constitutes cognitive distortion ranging from mild inaccuracy to gross misinterpretation. Binding of attention, constriction of awareness, selective abstraction, and distortion occur not only in acute anxiety neurosis but in other acute neuroses such as depression, hypomania, and paranoid state. These states differ in the kind of emotion experienced sadness, euphoria, anger. The difference in the emotion may be accounted for by the differences in the deviant meanings or the themes of thinking. As we shall see in each neurosis, reality is twisted to fit concepts that dominate the patient's thinking. Thinking distortions are also at the core of other neuroses such as hysteria, phobia, and obsessive compulsive neurosis. Neurotic disorders. Okay, let me go wash my hands real quick. Fucking fuck is that? So I really did want to try um, Coca Cola coffee shot with Diet Coke, but ice नहीं जमी है अभी, so that's a bummer. I'll just drink the Coke for now. Oh, fuck, that sounds good. That's good. And it is like perfectly cold as well. Okay, let's continue. Amazing book, by the way. Is Aaron T. Beck alive? Aaron T. Beck. Oh no, he died in 2021. Shit. He died in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Damn, he was. Shit, he died bad. What the fuck? Damn, she's 72. What the fuck? Sheesh. She doesn't have children. Beck Institute of Training for Organization, Training for Professionals, Central for CTR, on demand webinar, live virtual workshop, on demand courses, discounts, financial aid, continuing certification, clinicians working with youth, CPT Insight blog, resources for professional and student, resources for non professionals. What is this? Slow website. Okay. International resources about us. Behavioral wellness coaching, CBT certified clinician directory, training for professionals, Center for CTR, cognitive behavior therapy and recovery oriented cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive therapy for recovery. Why is there a cross? That's weird. Yeah, their website ain't working. Anyways, back to it. Neurotic disorders. Although acute emotional disturbance is not observed frequently by clinicians in Florida, characteristics. Florida? The fuck? Although the acute emotional disturbance is not observed frequently by clinicians, its florid characteristics illuminate the more subtle difficulties encountered in the more common form of neurotic reaction. In the less dramatic forms of neurosis, the thinking disturbance may occur only in certain situations or in relation to specific problems that impinge on the patient's vulnerabilities. Whether acute emotional disturbance is not observed frequently by clinicians, its florid characteristics illuminate the more subtle difficulties encountered in the more common forms of neurotic reactions. Okay. In the less dramatic forms of neurosis, the thinking disturbance may occur only in certain situations or in relation to specific problems that impinge on the patient's vulnerabilities. In other situations, his thinking is reasonably attuned to reality. Nonetheless, even the more chronic or milder forms of the neurosis are occasionally punctuated by episodes similar to the acute emotional disturbance. Since canalized thinking, attention fixation, and distortions of reality may occur in all the neuroses, and key differences among the neuroses are revealed in the content of the aberrant thinking rather than in its form. Later, we shall review other thinking peculiarities typical of the neurosis in general, but for the present, we shall examine the differences in the content. Okay, perfect. In those neuroses characterized by excessive emotional reactions, the emotional state characteristic of each disorder is evoked by the specific content of the aberrant thinking. Sadness, the typical emotion of depression, stems from patient's tendency to interpret his experience in terms of being deprived, deficient, or defeated. The euphoria observed in hypomanic states result from the perseverative preoccupation with ideas of self enhancement. The anxious patient experiences his feelings of distress by overinterpreting his experiences in terms of danger, while the paranoid patient feels intense anger because of his fixation on notions of being abused. The basic data for ascertaining the thinking disorder in neurotic patients were derived from verbatim notes of their verbal reports during psychotherapy or formal psychoanalysis. Back 1963 through 1967. These reports dealt with their major repetitive ideas, their descriptions of their interpretations of situations, and their automatic thoughts. The possibility that I may have influenced the nature of the patient's reports is minimized by the fact that my own preconceptions were contrary to the content that emerged. For instance, the repeated observation that depressed feelings and anxiety were based on cognitive distortions relevant to the theme of loss or danger, respectively, forced me to revise my thinking about these conditions. The new formulation gradually eased out the psychoanalytical theories that I had been taught and believed. That depression is caused by hostility turned against the self and anxiety is stimulated by the threat and the break into consciousness of a taboo wish. I initially reported my findings and conclusions based on 81 patients treated by me. The findings held for a later sample of 100 patients in treatment with me. I also found that by asking relevant questions during diagnostic interviews of patients in the clinic, the psychiatric residents obtained further confirmatory material. Concomitantly, I found support for the formulations in a number of controlled investigation by my research group and an independent observation and studies by other clinicians and researchers. I see. On the basis of the clinical observation and systemic studies, I am able to distinguish among the common neurotic disorders according to differences in the content of ideation. These differences are illustrated in the following table. Ideational content of neurotic disorders. Depression, devaluation of domain, idiosyncratic intentional content. Depression, ideational content. Devaluation of domain, inflated evaluation of domain, hypomania. Devaluation of domain, inflated evaluation of domain. Anxiety, neurosis, danger to domain. Phobia, danger connected with specific avoidable situations. Paranoid state, unjustified intrusion on domain. Hysteria, concept of motor or sensory abnormality. Obsession, warning or doubting. Compulsion, self command to perform specific act to ward off danger. Depression. The thought content of depressed patient centers on a significant loss. The patient perceives that he has lost something he considers essential to his happiness or trance and tranquility. He anticipates negative outcomes from an important undertaking and he regards himself as deficient in the attributes necessary for achieving important goals. This theme may be formulated in terms of the cognitive triad, a negative conception of the self, a negative interpretation of life experiences, and a nihilistic view of the future. The sense of irreversible loss and negative expectation leads to the typical emotions associated with depression: sadness, disappointment, and apathy. Furthermore, as the sense of being trapped in an unpleasant situation or of being enmeshed in insoluble problems increases, spontaneous constructive motivation dissipates. The patient, moreover, feels impelled to escape from the apparently intolerable condition via suicide. What? Fuck. Sorry about that. The sense of irreversible loss and negative expectation leads to the typical emotion associated with depression: sadness, disappointment, and apathy. Furthermore, as the sense of being trapped in an unpleasant situation or of being enmeshed in insoluble problems increases, spontaneous constructive motivation dissipates. The patient, moreover, feels impelled to escape from the apparently intolerable condition via suicide. Hypomanic state. The thought content of the hypomanic or manic patient is the reverse of that of the depressive. The manic or hypomanic patient perceives a significant gain in each of his life experiences. He indiscriminately attributes positive values to his experiences, unrealistically expects favorable results from his endeavors, and has exaggerated ideas of his abilities. These positive evaluations lead to feeling of euphoria. Moreover, the continued bombardment of inflated self-evaluation, overly optimistic expectations energizes and propels him into continuous activity. Anxiety neurosis. The thinking of the anxious patient is dominated by themes of danger to his domain. Anxiety neurosis. The thinking of the anxious patient Anxiety neurosis. The thinking of the anxious patient is dominated by themes of danger to his domain. That is, he anticipates detrimental occurrences to himself, his family, his property, or his status, or to other intangibles he values. In contrast to the phobic patient who experiences anxiety in avoidable situations, the anxiety neurotic perceives danger in situations he cannot avoid. A person who is continuously afraid of developing a serious or fatal illness may interpret any unusual physiological symptom as a sign of such illness. Shortness of breath may arouse the idea that he is having a heart attack. Diarrhea, constipation, or a vague pain may lead him to believe he has cancer. Frequently, his fears envelop external stimuli. He may interpret any unexpected sound as a signal of disaster. Noises in his house arouse fears of burglars breaking in, automobile breaking, fire suggests gunshots. A youngster's shout stimulates visions of physical violence. Many anxious patients are afraid predominantly of psychological harm. The thinking of ancient anxious patient is dominated by the themes of danger to his domain. That is, he anticipates detrimental occurrences to himself, his family, his property, or to his status, and to other intangibles he value. In contrast to the phobic patient who experiences anxiety in avoidable situations, the anxiety neurotic perceives danger in situations he cannot avoid. A person who is continuously afraid of developing a serious or fatal illness may interpret any unusual physiological symptom as a sign of such illness. Shortness of breath may arouse the idea that he is having a heart attack. Diarrhea, constipation, or a vague pain may lead him to believe he has cancer. Frequently, his fears envelop external stimuli. He may interpret any unexpected sound as a signal of disaster. Noises in his house arouse fears of burglars breaking in. Automobile backfires such as gunshots. A youngster shot simulates visions of physical violence. Many anxious patients are afraid predominantly of psychological harm. The anxious person is often concerned that other people, strangers as well as friends, will reject, humiliate, or depreciate him. The anxious person, bruh, what? Many anxious patients are afraid predominantly of psychological harm. Many anxious patients are afraid predominantly of psychological harm. The anxious person is often concerned that other people, strangers as well as friends, will reject, humiliate, or depreciate him. Hmm. Anticipation of physical or psychological harm is chained to anxiety. Consequently, when such expectations are formed, anxiety is stimulated. All right. Sorry about that. Phobia. And phobia is the anticipation of physical or psychological harm is confined to definable situations. If the patient can avoid these situations, then he does not feel threatened and may be tranquil. If he enters into these situations because of necessity or because of his own desire to overcome his problem, he experiences the typical subjective and physiological symptoms of the anxiety neurotic. As in the psychiatric disturbances described previously, the patient's cognitive response to the stimulus situation may be expressed in purely verbal form or in the form of imagery. A woman with a fear of heights who ventured into the 13th floor of a building promptly had a visual image of the floor tilting, of sliding toward the window, and of falling out. She experienced intense anxiety as though the image were an actual external event. Fears of particular situation are based on the patient's exaggerated conception of specific harmful attributes of these situations. A person with the tunnel phobia will experience fears that the tunnel will collapse on him, that he will suffocate, or he will have an acute life threatening illness and be unable to get help in time to save him. The acrophobic similarly reacts to high places with fear that he might fall off, the structure will collapse, or that he might jump off impulsively. Shit. Paranoid state. The paranoid patient perseverates in assuming that other people are deliberately abusing or interfering with his objectives. Unlike the depressed patient who feels that supposed insults or rejections are justified, the paranoid patient is preoccupied with the idea that an injustice has been done. The main theme in his thinking is I am right, he's wrong, in contrast to the depressed patient who follows the theme I am wrong, he's right. Unlike depressed patients, the paranoid patient does not experience any lowering of his self esteem. He is more concerned with the injustice of the attack on his domain than the actual loss of his domain. Differences among anxiety neurosis, neurotic depression, and paranoid state may be summarized as follows. The anxious patient focuses on the possibility of an attack. The paranoid patient concentrates on the injustice and malevolent motive behind a supposed attack or an infringement of his boundaries. The depressed patient focuses on the presumed loss he attributes to some inadequacy of his own. Obsessions and compulsions. The content of obsessions is generally concerned with some remote risk or danger expressed in the form of a doubt or warning. The person may continually doubt whether he has performed an act necessary to ensure his safety, for example, turning off a gas oven, or he may doubt whether he will be able to perform adequately. The thoughts differ from those of the anxiety neurotic and that they are concerned with an action the patient believes he should have taken or an action he should not have taken. As an example of the letter, a patient reportedly had the thought that he might have contracted leukemia because he touched the garment of a leukemia victim. Compulsions consist of attempts to allay excessive doubts or obsessions through action. A hand washing compulsion, for instance, is based on the patient's notion that he has not removed all the dirt or contaminants from parts of his body. He regards the dirt as a source of danger, either as a cause of physical disease or as a source of offensive odors. He often sees the triad of phobia, obsessive obsession, compulsion. A patient, for example, was afraid of being harmed by radiation. His phobia was manifested by avoiding contact with objects that might emit radiation. Clocks because of the radioactive dials or television sets. After unavoidable contact with such an object, he ruminated about the possibility of contamination. Obsession. This led him to taking frequent, prolonged baths to remove the presumed radioactive material. Compulsion. Hysterical reactions. The hysteria, the patient believes he has a physical disorder. In hysteria, the patient believes he has a physical disorder. Since the imagined disorder is not fatal, he tends to accept it without severe anxiety. Patients with hysteria are essentially sensory imagers. That is, they imagine the particular illness and then take the sensory experience as corroborative evidence of having the illness. The patient typically experiences sensory or motor abnormalities that fit the pattern of his or her concept of organic pathology. Hmm. Psychosis. Although the complicated subject of psychosis is beyond the scope of our inquiry, it might be useful to compare the thought content of psychosis with that of neurosis. The ideational theme of psychotic depression are analogous to those of neurotic depression. Paranoia or paranoid schizophrenia shows similar content to that of paranoid states. The manic reaction resembles the broad content of the hypomanic. The content of the ideation of the psychosis, however, is more bizarre, grotesque, and extreme than that of the neurosis. Whereas a neurotic depressive may view himself as being socially inadequate, the psychotic depressive may believe he emits disgusting odors that alienate other people. Psychosis, as a class, show more pronounced cognitive impairment than do neurosis. Psychoses are, as a class, show more pronounced cognitive impairment than do neuroses. The preservatives, preservative ideation is more intense and less subject to modification through corrective experience. The patient's capacity to view his erroneous ideas objectively is much more limited. Furthermore, the degree of illogical and unrealistic thinking is more pronounced. Nature of thinking disorders. A thinking disorder in the absence of organic pathology has generally been considered a feature of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. In contrast, depression, mania, and anxiety, with their florid emotional manifestation, have been regarded in a sense as affective or emotional disorders. However, there is no comparable evidence that a disorder in thinking, less gross and more circumscribed circumscribed than that described in schizophrenia is an important component of the common psychiatric syndromes. In a long term study, I found that each of the patients systemically misconstructed scientific kinds of experiences. However, there is now considerable evidence that the disorder in thinking less gross and more circumscribed than that described in schizophrenia is an important component of the common psychiatric syndromes. In a long term study, I found that each of the patients systemically misconstrued specific kinds of experiences. These distortions of reality range from subtle inaccuracies in the mild neurotics to the familiar grotesque misinterpretations and delusions in the psychotics. The peculiar ideation of the patient showed systemic departures from reality and logic, including arbitrary interference, selective abstraction, and overgeneralizations. These distortions occurred in ideation that was relevant to the patient's specific problem. For example, the depressed patient showed aberrations when he was thinking about his worth. The anxious patient when he was concerned with the notion of danger. Depressed patient showed aberrations when he was thinking about his worth, the anxious patient when he was concerned with the notion of danger. The distorted ideas had the characteristics of automatic thoughts. They appeared to arise as if by reflex without any apparent antecedent reflection or reasoning. They seemed plausible to the patient even though implausible to other people. Finally, they were less amenable to change by reason or contradictory evidence than were other forms of ideation not associated with the specific form of psychopathology. I observed a gradation of impaired thinking from the mild neurotic to severe psychotic. As the illness became intensified, the patient showed a progressively greater degree of distortion, increasing repetition of distorted ideas and progressive fixation of the distortions. Personalization. The inevitable egocentricity of man has intrigued writers and philosophers for ages. In a sense, everybody seems to have a private world of which he is the axis. Heiger and other have described how each individual constructs his own personal world. Nonetheless, people are generally capable of making objective judgments about external events or even about themselves and are able to disentangle the personal meaning of an event from its objective characteristics. They are able to make judgments on two different levels, one relevant to themselves or their domain, and the other detached from themselves. In psychiatric disorders, we find that egocentric interpretations become unusually compelling and may totally displace objective judgments. Labels such as personalization or self-reference are applied to the propensity to interpret events in terms of their personal meanings. Personalizations. The inevitable egocentricity of man has intrigued writers and philosophers for ages. In a sense, everybody seems to have a private world of which he is the axis. Heidegger and others have described how each individual constructs his own personal world. Nonetheless, people are generally capable of making objective judgments about external events or even about themselves and are able to disentangle the personal meaning of an event from its objective characteristic. They are able to make judgments on two different levels, one relevant to themselves or their domain, and the other detached from themselves. In psychiatric disorders, we find that egocentric interpretations become unusually compelling and may totally displace objective judgments. Labels such as personalization or self relevance are applied to the propensity to interpret events in terms of their personal meaning. I see. So basically, rationalizations. The process of personalization or self reference can be best illustrated by a few extreme examples. Specifically, patients who fall into the loose category of psychotic. A paranoid schizophrenic patient believed that the images he saw on the television screen were talking directly to him and he spoke back to them. A psychotic depressive heard about an epidemic of an infectious disease in a distant land, blamed himself for having caused it. A manic woman believed that everybody she passed on the street was in love with her. Psychotic patients consistently interpret events totally unrelated to them as though they were caused by them or directed against them. Less extreme forms of self relevance are found in neurotic patients. They tend to overestimate the degree to which events are related to them and to be excessively absorbed in the personal meaning of particular happenings. A depressed patient observing a frown on another person's face thinks he is with me, although it is conceivable that in this instance the patient's judgment is correct. His error lies in his notion that every grimace he observes in other people represents disgust with him. He overinterrupts the frequency as well as the degree of negative feelings he evokes in other people. Depressed mother blames herself for every perfection in her children, for every imperfection in her children. An anxious patient relates every danger signal to himself. A passing ambulance makes him think his child has had an accident. Another form of personalization is found in man's irrepressible. tendency to compare himself with other people. A man observing a billboard of a happy mother and child thinks she's a much more devoted mother than I. A student hearing that another student has won a prize thinks I must be dumb or I would have won the prize. A young phobic patient reading an elderly person having a heart attack thinks if he had a heart attack it could happen to me and starts to feel pain in his chest. The basic egocentric coloring may be found in each of the facets of aberrant thinking of neurotic patients. The process of decentering that